Chapter 1. The Mysterious Pattern. Miss Jane Marple was arranging the late autumn roses in her sitting room when she heard the familiar rattle of the letterbox. It was rather early for the post, she thought, glancing at the clock on the mantelpiece. The little village of St. Mary Mead kept to its rhythms with remarkable precision, which was why any deviation was noteworthy to its more observant residents. "Good morning, Miss Marple," called the postman cheerfully from the garden path. "Special delivery for you today." Needed a signature, it did. "How very curious," Miss Marple murmured, wiping her hands on her apron before making her way to the door. She rarely received packages requiring signatures. The parcel was neatly wrapped in brown paper, her name and address written in a familiar hand that caused her to raise her eyebrows slightly. She carried it to her favorite armchair by the window, where the morning light was best for her increasingly troublesome eyes, and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a half-finished knitting project, a shawl from the look of it, with an intricate pattern unlike any she had seen before. The wool was of excellent quality, and the needles were still attached, as though the knitter had set it down mid-stitch. Beneath the knitting was a folded note, which Miss Marple opened with fingers that had grown slightly stiff with age, but remained remarkably nimble. "Dear Miss Marple," the note read in Eleanor Pritchard's distinctive handwriting, "I fear I shall not be able to complete this pattern. Perhaps you will see what I have seen. Trust no one." Miss Marple frowned. Eleanor Pritchard had been a member of her knitting circle for many years before moving to London 3 years ago. A sensible woman, not given to dramatics or cryptic messages. They had corresponded occasionally, but this was most unlike her. With careful fingers, Miss Marple spread the knitting across her lap. The pattern was indeed unusual, not simply in its design, which was complex enough, but in its execution. There were irregularities that a knitter of Eleanor's skill would never allow unless— She held the work closer to her eyes, examining a section where the stitches varied in tension. Not mistakes, surely. Eleanor had been one of the most meticulous knitters she had ever known. These variations appeared intentional, as did the curious changes in color that didn't seem to follow any conventional pattern logic. "How very odd," she murmured to herself, turning the piece over to examine the reverse side. There was something about the pattern that tickled at the back of her mind. A memory or association she couldn't quite grasp. The shrill ring of the telephone startled her from her examination. Miss Marple carefully set the knitting aside and made her way to the hallway where the telephone stood on its little table. "Miss Marple speaking," she answered. "Miss Marple, this is Inspector Craddock." The voice on the other end was familiar, and brought back memories of several previous encounters with Scotland Yard. "Good morning, Inspector. How nice to hear from you." There was a pause before he continued, his tone grave. "I'm afraid I'm calling with some rather troubling news. Do you know a Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard?" Miss Marple's hand tightened on the receiver. "Yes, indeed. I've just this morning received a package from her." "I see." Another pause. "I'm very sorry to inform you that Mrs. Pritchard was found dead in her London flat yesterday evening. Despite her years and the many tragedies she had witnessed, Miss Marple felt the shock of the news keenly. Oh dear, that is most distressing. May I ask, the circumstances?" "It appears to be suicide, Miss Marple. Sleeping pills. The preliminary examination suggests she took them the night before last." "I see," said Miss Marple quietly, though her mind was already connecting this information with the arrival of the package and its strange contents. "There's something else," the inspector continued. "Your name and address were found typed on a sheet of paper in Mrs. Pritchard's typewriter. That's why I'm calling personally. Did she contact you recently, apart from this package you mentioned? No, not for several months. We exchanged Christmas cards last year, and she wrote a brief note in February about the death of a mutual acquaintance. I see. Would you mind if I came to see you, Miss Marple? There are some questions I'd like to ask about Mrs. Pritchard. Of course, Inspector. I shall be at home all day. After replacing the receiver, Miss Marple stood for a moment in thought, her eyes distant. Poor Eleanor. It seemed impossible that the sensible, collected woman she had known would take her own life. And that note, "Trust no one," hardly suggested a woman planning suicide. She returned to her armchair and picked up the knitting once more, studying it with fresh attention. If Eleanor had sent this just before her death, there must be significance to it beyond a simple, unfinished project. The irregularities in the stitches continued to trouble her. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and held the knitting at arm's length, tilting her head slightly, and then she saw it, what had been nagging at her subconscious. When viewed from a certain angle, the irregular stitches formed a pattern of their own, a pattern that looked remarkably like letters. Her breath caught. The knitting slipped from her fingers to her lap as the realization dawned. This was no ordinary knitting pattern. This was a message, a coded message from a woman who feared for her life. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line as she carefully folded the knitting and placed it back in its wrapping. By the time Inspector Craddock arrived, she would need to have a clearer understanding of what Eleanor Pritchard had been trying to tell her. Because one thing was certain, whatever Eleanor had seen, whatever knowledge had led to her death, it was now in Miss Marple's hands, concealed in the innocent-looking stitches of an unfinished shawl. She rose and moved to her desk, taking out her magnifying glass and a pad of paper. If there was a message hidden in the pattern, she would find it. After all, patterns were Miss Marple's specialty, not just in knitting, but in human behavior. And in her experience, the most dangerous patterns were those deliberately designed to deceive. As she began her methodical examination of the stitches, the morning sun cast long shadows across the room, and somewhere in the garden a blackbird gave its alarm call, a warning that went unheeded by all except those who knew the significance of such things. Just as Miss Marple knew that Eleanor Pritchard's death was no suicide, but the silencing of someone who had discovered a truth that someone was desperate to keep hidden. Chapter 2. Village Gossip at Tea Time. Miss Marple arranged the tea tray with particular care that afternoon. The Crown Derby teapot had been polished to a gentle gleam, and she had instructed her faithful maid Cherry to bring out the best scones and seed cake. If one wished to extract information, Miss Marple knew from long experience, one must provide the proper setting for confidences. The doorbell rang precisely at 4 o'clock. Dolly Bantry had always been punctual, a quality Miss Marple appreciated in a friend. "My dear Jane," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, as she swept into the sitting-room, removing her gloves. "I came the moment I received your note. Is it true about poor Eleanor Pritchard? Suicide, they're saying in the village." Miss Marple gestured toward the armchair opposite her own. "Do sit down, Dolly." "Yes. I'm afraid it is true that Eleanor has died, though I have my doubts about it being suicide." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened with interest as she settled herself. "Do you indeed? How intriguing. Such a sensible woman, I always thought." "Not the type at all." "My thoughts exactly," Miss Marple replied, pouring tea into the delicate cups. "Milk and 1 sugar, isn't it?" "Perfect as always, Jane. Your memory never fails." Mrs. Bantry accepted the cup. "But what makes you doubt the official story? Have you heard something?" Miss Marple hesitated, then reached for the brown paper package beside her chair. Eleanor sent me this. It arrived this morning, posted, I imagine, shortly before her death. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward to examine the half-finished knitting project that Miss Marple carefully spread across the small table between them. A shawl? I didn't know Eleanor was still knitting. She wrote to me last Christmas that her arthritis was troubling her hands. Indeed. That's most interesting. Miss Marple filed away this detail. Tell me, Dolly, when was the last time you saw Eleanor? Mrs. Bantry sipped her tea thoughtfully. It must have been when she visited just last week. Quite unexpectedly, she turned up at the village fete. Didn't stay long. Just a day or two, I believe. Miss Marple's needles, which had been clicking steadily as she worked on her own knitting, paused momentarily. Eleanor was here in St. Mary Mead last week? How curious that she didn't call on me. Oh, she seemed quite preoccupied, Mrs. Bantry continued, helping herself to a scone. I spotted her in deep conversation with Colonel Edwards. They were sitting on the bench by the war memorial, heads together like conspirators. She chuckled at the image. I did try to catch her eye, but she seemed so engrossed that I didn't like to interrupt. Colonel Edwards, Miss Marple repeated softly. Now that is interesting. Why so? Mrs. Bantry asked, curiosity piqued. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her expression thoughtful. The Colonel worked in military intelligence during the war, did he not? And Eleanor, if I recall correctly, had some position at the Foreign Office. Oh, yes. Quite an important one, I gathered, though she never spoke much about it. Pattern analysis or code breaking or some such thing. She had a remarkable eye for patterns, as I recall. Mrs. Bantry glanced down at the unfinished shawl. Much like yourself, Jane. Miss Marple smiled slightly. We had that in common, certainly. It's a useful skill, seeing the patterns in things, and in people. I've always thought it extraordinary how Eleanor left the village so suddenly, Mrs. Bantry continued, warming to the topic. Right after Reverend Hawthorne arrived, wasn't it? I remember because it was such a busy time in the parish. The new vicar had barely settled in when Eleanor announced she was moving to London. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes sharpened with interest, though her expression remained placid. Was it indeed? I hadn't connected those events before. Oh yes, quite definite. In fact, Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice conspiratorially. There was some talk at the time. Not that I listened to gossip, of course. But Mrs. Phelps from the church committee mentioned that Eleanor seemed quite upset after meeting the Reverend. White as a sheet, she said. How very odd. Miss Marple poured a second cup of tea for them both. And did anyone know why? Mrs. Bantry shook her head. Eleanor was always rather private, wasn't she? But it did strike people as strange. One day she was fully engaged in village affairs. The next she was packing for London. Left her cottage to her niece, that girl who married the doctor in Eastbourne. And Reverend Hawthorne, what do you make of him, now that he's been with us for 3 years? Miss Marple asked, keeping her tone casual. Oh, very impressive. Wonderful sermons, so learned. Though between you and me, Mrs. Bantry leaned forward again, I find him a trifle remote. Colonel Edwards can't abide him, won't attend services when he's preaching. Indeed? I hadn't noticed that. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked rhythmically. The Colonel says there's something not quite right about him. Military men have instincts about these things, I suppose. Mrs. Bantry observed, then laughed lightly. Though the Colonel is getting rather dotty these days, so perhaps it's nothing. After Dolly Bantry had departed, full of cake and the importance of being Miss Marple's confidant in what promised to be another of her friend's peculiar mysteries, Miss Marple sat quietly reflecting. She had gleaned more than she had anticipated from the conversation. Eleanor's unexpected visit to the village, her mysterious conversation with Colonel Edwards, and most intriguingly, the coincidence of her departure with Reverend Hawthorne's arrival 3 years ago. Miss Marple decided a visit to the vicarage was in order. She gathered her knitting bag, placing Eleanor's unfinished shawl inside it, and set out through the garden gate. The late afternoon air held the crispness of approaching winter, and Miss Marple walked briskly, nodding to various villagers as she passed. St. Mary Mead might appear to be a sleepy backwater to outsiders, but to Jane Marple it was a microcosm of human behaviour in all its complexity and its darkness. Reverend Hawthorne was pruning roses in the vicarage garden when she arrived. A tall, lean man with silver-streaked dark hair, he straightened up at her approach, secateurs in hand. "Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise," he greeted her, though she noted that his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good afternoon, Vicar. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all. I was just finishing up. Would you care to come inside for tea? Mrs. Wilkins has made some excellent shortbread." They settled in his study, a comfortable room lined with theological texts and historical volumes. Miss Marple accepted tea, but declined the shortbread, having already indulged with Dolly Bantry. "It's a sad business about Mrs. Pritchard," the vicar remarked, stirring his tea. "The news reached me this morning." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, watching him carefully. "Such a tragedy. Did you know her well?" There it was, just the briefest stiffening of his shoulders before he replied, "Not well, no. She left the village shortly after I arrived, as I recall." "Yes, quite a coincidence," Miss Marple said mildly. "She worked at the Foreign Office during the war, I believe. Such interesting work, code breaking and the like." Reverend Hawthorne set down his teacup with a faint clink. "Did she indeed? I wasn't aware of that, though many people did remarkable things during those dark days that they seldom speak of afterward." "Quite true," Miss Marple agreed. "And yourself, Vicar? Were you in the services?" "Army chaplain," he replied smoothly. "Not a very distinguished career, I'm afraid. Now, was there something specific I could help you with today, Miss Marple?" She smiled gently. "No, no. Just a social call. One feels these losses more keenly at my age, and I find company a comfort." After leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple made one further stop at the village post office, where Miss Higgins was just closing up for the day. "Miss Marple, just in time. I was about to lock the door," the postmistress exclaimed. "Just a moment of your time, if you would, Miss Higgins," Miss Marple said. "I was wondering if you recalled anything unusual about Mrs. Pritchard's correspondence before she left the village, or perhaps since then." Miss Higgins's eyes lit up with the pleasure of someone whose observations were finally being valued. "Oh, indeed." There were several urgent telegrams just before she left, most unusual for Mrs. Pritchard, who was generally such a regular sort of person, and since then she wrote regularly to an address in Switzerland, every month, as regular as clockwork. "Switzerland?" Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "Yes, somewhere near Geneva, though I couldn't say exactly where." Miss Higgins lowered her voice. "Foreign correspondence was always noted in our log, you see. Regulations." "Of course. Most helpful." Miss Marple thanked her and made her way home as dusk was falling. Back in her cottage, she settled into her armchair and once again spread Eleanor's knitting across her lap. Working carefully by lamplight, she traced the irregular stitches, noting their positions in the pattern. After nearly an hour of meticulous examination, she sat back in her chair, a look of quiet triumph on her face. The irregular stitches, when properly aligned, formed a series of numbers and letters. Not words, but what appeared to be a reference code of some kind. Miss Marple copied the sequence carefully onto a sheet of notepaper. VF 43 117 NP. As she stared at the code, her mind worked through its possible meanings. VF might stand for vital file or verified fact. 43 could be a year. 1943, during the height of the war. 117 might be a page number or file reference. And NP... Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly as a possibility occurred to her. NP-needlepoint. It was a common enough term in knitting circles, but something told her that in this context it might have an entirely different significance. She carefully folded Eleanor's knitting and placed it in the drawer of her bedside table. Tomorrow, Inspector Craddock would arrive, and she would have questions for him. Questions about wartime operations, classified documents, and why a woman with knowledge of codes had sent her final message concealed in the stitches of an unfinished shawl. Chapter 3. The Inspector Arrives. The following morning dawned with a silvery frost coating the garden of Miss Marple's cottage. She had been awake since before sunrise, her mind too preoccupied with Eleanor Pritchard's knitting pattern to permit restful sleep. After an early breakfast, she had carefully examined the unfinished shawl once more, confirming her discovery of the code sequence, and searching for any additional clues she might have missed. At precisely 10 o'clock, a black police car pulled up outside her gate. Miss Marple watched from her sitting-room window as Inspector Craddock emerged, his tall figure familiar from their previous encounters. She had always found him a most satisfactory detective, intelligent, respectful of her observations, and not prone to the dismissive attitude some younger men adopted toward elderly ladies. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he greeted her as she opened the door. "I trust I haven't called too early?" "Not at all, Inspector. I've been expecting you. Do come in out of the cold." She led him into the sitting-room, where a cheerful fire crackled in the grate. The inspector removed his coat, revealing a well-cut suit that spoke of his usual meticulous attention to appearance. "I'm afraid I come with rather disturbing news," he said, once they were seated. "The autopsy results on Mrs. Pritchard have revealed that her death was not suicide, after all." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "I suspected as much. Eleanor was not the type to take her own life." "May I ask what they found?" The sleeping pills were indeed the cause of death, but the dosage was far higher than she could have administered to herself. Moreover, traces of another sedative were found in what appears to have been her evening tea. The inspector's expression was grave. "It was murder, Miss Marple, carefully arranged to look like suicide." "I see," she replied quietly. "Poor Eleanor. She must have known she was in danger, hence the package she sent to me." "Yes, about that package." The inspector leaned forward slightly. "You mentioned it yesterday. May I see it?" Miss Marple retrieved the unfinished knitting from her bedside drawer and carefully laid it out on the small table between them. "It's a knitting pattern for a shawl, but as you can see, there are irregularities in the stitches." Inspector Craddock frowned, studying the woolwork with a puzzled expression. "I'm afraid I don't see anything unusual, but then I know nothing about knitting." "The irregularities form a pattern of their own," Miss Marple explained, pointing with her thin, capable finger. "When properly aligned, they create what appears to be a code or reference number, VF 43 117 NP. The inspector's eyes sharpened with interest. "A code? Are you certain?" "Quite certain. And there's something else you should know, Inspector. Mrs. Pritchard worked at the Foreign Office during the war, in some capacity related to codes and patterns. I believe this knitting was her way of passing on information she felt was dangerous. Information that may have led to her death. Craddock took out his notebook and carefully wrote down the code sequence. This is extremely interesting, Miss Marple. As it happens, Mrs. Pritchard had recently been rehired by the Foreign Office on a part-time basis. Had she indeed? Miss Marple's pale blue eyes registered mild surprise. Yes, she was working as a translator for sensitive historical documents, specifically wartime communications being declassified for historical archives. He hesitated, then added, "This information is confidential, of course." "Of course," Miss Marple assured him. "But it does explain a great deal. If Eleanor discovered something in those old documents, something that contradicted the official record, perhaps." "Precisely what I was thinking," the inspector agreed. "This code you found might well refer to specific documents from 1943, given the 43 component." Miss Marple nodded. "My thoughts exactly. And the NP portion, could that possibly stand for needlepoint?" Inspector Craddock looked up sharply. "Needlepoint? Why do you suggest that particular word?" "It seemed a logical possibility, given the medium of the message." Miss Marple gestured toward the knitting. "Though I suspect it might have a significance beyond the obvious." The inspector was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Marple, I believe you may have stumbled onto something important. Operation Needlepoint was a classified wartime operation involving intelligence gathering in occupied France. The details remain sensitive even now." "I see," said Miss Marple quietly. "And Eleanor would have had access to those files in her new position." "Potentially, yes." Inspector Craddock closed his notebook. "I'll need to make some inquiries at the Foreign Office. In the meantime, I'd like to speak with anyone in the village who had contact with Mrs. Pritchard during her recent visit." "I believe Colonel Edwards would be your best starting point," Miss Marple suggested. "I understand they had quite an intense conversation just a week before her death." After the inspector departed, Miss Marple put on her hat and coat and made her way to Colonel Edwards' house on the outskirts of the village. The colonel lived alone, except for his housekeeper, Mrs. Green, who admitted Miss Marple with a concerned expression. "He's not been himself today, Miss Marple," the housekeeper confided in a low voice. "Ever since he heard about Mrs. Pritchard yesterday. Shut himself in his study, he has, barely touching his meals." Miss Marple found the colonel seated by the window of his study, a military history open on his lap, though his eyes were fixed on the garden beyond. At 75, he remained an imposing figure, straight-backed and clear-eyed, with the bearing of a man accustomed to command. "Colonel Edwards?" Miss Marple greeted him gently. "I hope I'm not intruding." He turned, registering her presence with a slight start. "Miss Marple." "No, no, please come in. I'm afraid I'm not very good company today." "I understand you are acquainted with Eleanor Pritchard," she said, taking the seat he offered. The colonel's weathered face seemed to age further at the mention of Eleanor's name. "Yes, we were colleagues, of a sort, during the war. Not directly, our paths rarely crossed, but we worked in related fields." "Intelligence work?" Miss Marple asked quietly. He gave her a sharp look. "You always were uncommonly perceptive, Miss Marple. Yes, intelligence. Eleanor had a remarkable gift for patterns and codes. Saved a good many lives with that gift. I believe she spoke with you during her visit last week." The colonel was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming restlessly on the arm of his chair. "She did. She was troubled." Said she'd found something in the old files that didn't match what she remembered. Something about Operation Needlepoint. Miss Marple's heart quickened at the confirmation of her theory, but her expression remained placid. "And what was Operation Needlepoint, Colonel, if you're permitted to say?" He sighed heavily. "It's ancient history now, though the government still keeps it classified. Needlepoint was a network of resistance operatives in occupied France. They used knitting patterns as a means of encoding and transmitting intelligence, hiding messages in plain sight in women's magazines and knitting pamphlets." "How ingenious," Miss Marple murmured, thinking of Eleanor's final message. "It was, until the network was exposed." The Colonel's face darkened. 12 agents lost, betrayed by a double agent we knew as the Weaver. At least, that was the official story. And Eleanor found evidence suggesting otherwise? The Colonel hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. She believed she'd found proof that the Weaver was innocent, that someone else had betrayed the network, someone whose identity had been protected all these years. "Did she tell you who?" "No." He shook his head firmly. "She was being cautious, said she needed to find one more piece of evidence before she could be certain. She asked if I still had any photographs from that period, of the communications team who handled the needlepoint transmissions." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "And did you?" "A few. I showed her what I had." He rose stiffly and crossed to a large oak desk, unlocking a drawer with a key from his pocket. "This is the one she was most interested in." He handed Miss Marple a faded black and white photograph, showing a group of young officers standing before a country house. Eleanor had marked one face with a small cross in pencil on the back. A serious young man with dark hair, standing somewhat apart from the others. "Lieutenant James Hawkins," the Colonel said, noting where her attention had focused. "Communications officer. Handled a lot of the coded transmissions for Needlepoint." Miss Marple studied the face carefully, a curious sensation of recognition stirring in her mind. There was something familiar about the set of the jaw, the slightly distant expression. "Colonel?" she asked carefully. "Whatever became of Lieutenant Hawkins after the war?" "Disappeared into civilian life, like so many. I lost track of him." The Colonel took back the photograph, replacing it in the drawer. Eleanor seemed quite disturbed after seeing this picture, left in quite a hurry. As Miss Marple made her way back through the village, she found herself passing the vicarage. On impulse, she paused to observe Reverend Hawthorne, who was speaking with the churchwarden by the lich gate. Something about his profile, the way he held himself. A chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air ran through her. Lieutenant James Hawkins, Reverend James Hawthorne. The similarity in names could hardly be coincidence. Following an intuition, Miss Marple made her way to the old manor house on the edge of the village. The coordinates she had deciphered from Eleanor's knitting pointed to this location, specifically to a hollow oak tree that had stood on the grounds for centuries. It took her some time to find it, and her knees protested at the uneven ground, but eventually she located the ancient tree with its distinctive gnarled trunk. The hollow was at waist height, partially hidden by ivy. Reaching in cautiously, her fingers touched something metallic, a small tin box, tarnished with age. She withdrew it carefully and opened the lid. Inside was a small diary bound in faded blue leather, its pages yellowed with time. Several dried flowers had been pressed between the pages, marking certain sections. The diary was written in French, the handwriting small and precise. Miss Marple recognized enough words to determine that it belonged to someone named Madeleine, almost certainly Madeleine Fournier, one of the key members of the needlepoint network who had been captured and executed by the Gestapo. The sound of footsteps on the path behind her made Miss Marple quickly slip the diary into her knitting bag. She turned to find herself face to face with a young gardener who tipped his cap respectfully. "Afternoon, miss. Looking for mushrooms, are you?" "Just enjoying a little nature walk," she replied with a smile. "The autumn colours are so lovely." As she made her way back toward the village green, a car approached from behind, moving rather faster than was customary on the narrow lane. Miss Marple stepped aside to let it pass, but to her alarm, the vehicle swerved toward her. Only a quick step behind a large oak tree saved her from being struck. The car accelerated away, leaving her shaken but unhurt. It had happened too quickly for her to identify the driver, but one thing was certain. What had just occurred was no accident. Someone had seen her retrieve the diary and had attempted to silence her, just as they had silenced Eleanor Pritchard. The game had suddenly become very dangerous indeed. Chapter 4. Decoding the Stitches. Miss Marple sat in her cottage that evening with Madeleine Fournier's diary spread before her on the table, a French dictionary at her elbow, and Eleanor's knitting pattern alongside. The attempt on her life that afternoon had left her shaken but more determined than ever to uncover the truth behind Eleanor's murder. A knock at the door interrupted her concentration. It was Inspector Craddock, looking grave. "I heard about the incident on the lane," he said without preamble as he entered. "Mrs. Wilkins from the bakery saw it happen and reported it immediately. Are you quite all right, Miss Marple?" "Perfectly fine, thank you, Inspector." "Do sit down." As he took a seat, his gaze fell on the diary. "What's this?" "A rather significant discovery," Miss Marple explained. "I found it hidden in a hollow tree on the manor grounds, precisely where the coordinates in Eleanor's knitting pattern indicated." The inspector's eyebrows rose. "You managed to decipher coordinates from the knitting?" "Indeed. Certain knots and loops in the pattern correspond to map references. Once I realized that, it became quite straightforward." Miss Marple handed him the diary. "This belonged to Madeleine Fournier, a member of the Needlepoint Network. It's in French, but I've been able to translate portions with my dictionary." Craddock carefully turned the pages, noting the pressed flowers. "These markings seem deliberate." "Yes, I believe they indicate important passages. The diary itself is quite cryptic. Madeleine was clearly careful not to write anything that would endanger her fellow operatives if it fell into enemy hands." Miss Marple picked up her knitting needles, her fingers working steadily as she spoke. "But I've made some progress with it, and what I've found aligns with what Colonel Edwards told me earlier." "Which was?" "That Eleanor believed the Weaver, the person officially blamed for betraying the Needlepoint Network, was innocent. The diary entries suggest that Madeleine Fournier had suspicions about the true identity of the traitor." "Did she name names?" "Not directly. She refers to someone using the code name The Shepherd." "Tell me, Inspector, what have you learned about Operation Needlepoint?" Craddock leaned back in his chair. "I've spent the afternoon consulting with colleagues at the Foreign Office. You were right. Needlepoint was an intelligence operation using knitting patterns as a code. The patterns were published in women's magazines distributed in occupied France, allowing seemingly innocent publications to carry detailed information about German troop movements, supply lines, and so forth. And it was remarkably effective until the network was betrayed," Miss Marple observed. "Precisely. In late 1943, 12 members of the network were arrested by the Gestapo. The operation was completely compromised." The inspector's voice was grim. "After the war, investigations pointed to a double agent codenamed the Weaver as the traitor. He was tried in a closed military court and executed in 1946. But what if they executed the wrong man? Miss Marple's pale blue eyes were troubled. What if Eleanor found evidence in those declassified cables that exonerated the weaver and implicated someone else instead? That would certainly be a motive for murder, Craddock acknowledged. Many reputations, and possibly current positions of power, would be at stake if such a miscarriage of justice were exposed. Miss Marple nodded. Inspector, I believe we should pay another visit to Colonel Edwards. He has photographs and possibly other documentation from that period that might help us identify the shepherd. Their conversation was interrupted by the telephone ringing. The inspector answered, his expression darkening as he listened. I see. We'll be right there. He hung up and turned to Miss Marple. Colonel Edwards has been found unconscious in his study, an apparent suicide attempt with sleeping pills. The same method used to murder Eleanor? Miss Marple asked sharply. It appears so. His housekeeper found him and called for help. He's been taken to the hospital in Much Benham. Craddock helped Miss Marple with her coat. This can't be coincidence. As they drove to the Colonel's house, Miss Marple's mind was racing, connecting threads of evidence, seeing a pattern slowly emerge from seeming chaos, just as she had deciphered the pattern in Eleanor's knitting. Inspector, she said suddenly, did your colleagues mention anything about Lieutenant James Hawkins? The communications officer? Yes, they did. He was responsible for encoding many of the needlepoint messages. Craddock glanced at her curiously. Why do you ask? I believe he may be living in St. Mary Mead under a different name. Miss Marple hesitated, then added, I suspect he may be Reverend James Hawthorne. The vicar? That's quite an accusation, Miss Marple. It's merely a theory at this point, she conceded, but the timing of events is suggestive. Eleanor left the village abruptly when Reverend Hawthorne arrived 3 years ago. If she recognized him from her wartime work. At the Colonel's house, they found several police officers already on the scene. Mrs. Green, the housekeeper, was distraught. He was fine when I left to do the marketing, she sobbed. When I returned, I found him slumped at his desk with an empty pill bottle beside him. While the inspector spoke with the officers, Miss Marple quietly made her way to the Colonel's study. The desk remained as it had been found, a half-empty glass of whiskey beside scattered papers and an empty pill bottle. Miss Marple noted that the drawer where the Colonel had kept his wartime photographs stood open. She returned to the sitting room just as Craddock was concluding his interview with Mrs. Green. Inspector, Miss Marple said quietly, the drawer containing the Colonel's photographs has been opened. Were any found on or near his desk? A quick check confirmed that no photographs were among the papers, though there was a clear space on the blotter where something might have been removed. Someone took them, Miss Marple concluded. Someone who needed to eliminate evidence that might connect him to Operation Needlepoint. Back at her cottage that evening, Miss Marple continued her work on Eleanor's knitting pattern, now even more convinced that it contained vital evidence. The colour changes in the wool, she realized, were not merely decorative, but formed a simple substitution cipher when matched with certain stitches. Slowly, painstakingly, she worked out the message. The traitor was not who they said. Evidence in the pattern. Beware the shepherd. Miss Marple sat back, her heart racing despite her outward calm. The shepherd, Reverend Hawthorne. The coincidence of names suddenly made terrible sense. Not Hawkins to Hawthorne, but a play on words. The shepherd, who led his flock. Who better to take on the role of vicar than a man seeking to hide his past? And then another connection clicked into place. The shepherd, not as a spy handler as everyone had assumed, but literally Reverend Hawthorne, whose previous identity as Lieutenant Hawkins had placed him in the perfect position to betray the needlepoint network. Eleanor must have recognized him when he arrived in St. Mary Mead 3 years ago, perhaps not immediately, but something about him had triggered her memory. She had fled to London, only returning when her work with the declassified files had confirmed her suspicions. She had sought out Colonel Edwards, shown him the evidence, then sent her final message to Miss Marple before confronting Hawthorne, the confrontation that had cost Eleanor her life. Miss Marple picked up the telephone and dialed Inspector Craddock's number. This was no longer a matter of historical interest. A murderer was walking free in St. Mary Mead, and if her deductions were correct, he had already claimed 2 victims. Chapter 5. Miss Marple's Revelation. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns across the diary that lay open on her desk. She had spent most of the night translating Madeleine Fournier's entries, her French dictionary well thumbed, her eyes tired but alert. Now, as she sat with a cup of tea warming her hands, she began to see the full picture with disturbing clarity. The diary, though written in necessarily oblique language, told a compelling story. Madeleine had been the primary courier for the needlepoint network, distributing the seemingly innocent knitting patterns that contained vital intelligence. By the autumn of 1943, she had begun to suspect that information was being leaked. Operations were failing with alarming frequency. Agents were being arrested within days of receiving new instructions. In one entry, marked with a pressed forget-me-not, Madeleine had written, "I no longer believe it is C who betrays us. The evidence points elsewhere, to someone who sees all messages before they reach our friends. I fear it may be Le Berger. God help us if I am right." Le Berger, the shepherd. Miss Marple's suspicions about Reverend Hawthorne strengthened. As a communications officer, Lieutenant Hawkins would have had access to the encoded messages before they were transmitted. He could have altered crucial details, meeting points, recognition signals, safe house locations, sending agents unwittingly into traps. The pressed flowers, Miss Marple realized, were not sentimental keepsakes, but a code themselves. In her youth, she had been familiar with the Victorian language of flowers, where each bloom carried a specific meaning. Forget-me-not for true love and memories, yes, but also for secrets and revelations. She carefully examined each pressed specimen, noting their positions in the diary. Rosemary for remembrance marked a page describing a failed rendezvous. Cyclamen for resignation and goodbye near an entry about a captured agent. Yellow carnation, disdain and rejection, beside a mention of the English officer with the cold eyes. The telephone's sharp ring interrupted her thoughts. It was Inspector Craddock. "I've just come from the hospital," he said without preamble. "Colonel Edwards is conscious, but very weak. The doctors say it's remarkable he survived. The dose was substantial." "Do they still believe it was a suicide attempt?" Miss Marple asked. "Officially, yes, but privately, the doctor admitted to me that the colonel claims he only took his usual sleeping tablet before his evening whiskey." Craddock's voice lowered. "Someone could have tampered with his medication, replacing his regular pills with a much stronger dose." "Just as with Eleanor Pritchard," Miss Marple observed. "Has the colonel been able to tell you anything useful?" "Very little. He's quite confused. He keeps mentioning something about pressed flowers and a woman named Madeleine." There was a pause. "That diary you found, it belonged to a Madeleine, didn't it?" "Yes, Madeleine Fournier. She was a key member of the needlepoint network." Miss Marple hesitated, then added, "Inspector, I believe I've deciphered much of what the diary contains. It provides the missing piece that Eleanor must have discovered. Evidence that the weaver was wrongly accused, and that the true traitor was someone codenamed the Shepherd. And you still believe this Shepherd is Reverend Hawthorne? I do. The diary refers to him as the English officer with the cold eyes. Colonel Edwards showed Eleanor a photograph in which Lieutenant James Hawkins appears. The same man who is now our vicar. I'm certain of it. Miss Marple's voice was firm. Inspector, I think we should confront him with what we know. After the attempts on Eleanor and the Colonel's lives, I fear others may be in danger. I agree. I'll come to St. Mary Mead immediately. Don't approach Hawthorne before I arrive, Miss Marple. The urgency in Craddock's voice was clear. This man has already killed once and attempted it twice. He's dangerous. After replacing the receiver, Miss Marple returned to her examination of the diary. The final pressed flower, a white shepherd's purse, marked the very last entry, dated 3 days before Madeline's arrest by the Gestapo. The entry was brief and chilling. I have proof now. The changed coordinates could only have come from one source. If I do not return from tomorrow's meeting, look to the one who signs with his namesake flower. Shepherd's purse, a common wildflower with heart-shaped seed pods. Miss Marple remembered seeing it growing in the churchyard just the previous Sunday, a fitting signature for a man now posing as a shepherd of souls. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Through the window, she saw Inspector Craddock's car parked at her gate. She quickly gathered the diary and Eleanor's knitting, placing them in her knitting bag before answering the door. "You've made good time, Inspector," she greeted him. "The Colonel's condition has worsened," he replied grimly. "The doctors aren't certain he'll survive the day. We need to act quickly." Together, they formulated a plan. The diary would serve as bait, evidence that Hawthorne would be desperate to destroy. They would confront him at the vicarage, with 2 constables stationed discreetly nearby in case of trouble. The vicarage sat in afternoon shadow when they arrived, the autumn sun already low in the sky. Reverend Hawthorne received them in his study, his manner polite but reserved. "Inspector Craddock, Miss Marple. This is an unexpected pleasure. What can I do for you?" "We'd like to talk to you about Eleanor Pritchard," the inspector began, watching the vicar carefully. "A terrible tragedy," Hawthorne said smoothly. "I understand from village gossip that it wasn't suicide after all?" "No, it wasn't," Craddock confirmed. "Mrs. Pritchard was murdered, and we believe it was because she discovered something in the historical files she was translating for the Foreign Office." "How dreadful. But I fail to see how I can help with a London murder investigation." The vicar's expression remained composed, but Miss Marple noticed his left hand move slightly toward the desk drawer. "It concerns Operation Needlepoint," she said quietly, watching his reaction. There it was, the barest flicker in his eyes, quickly controlled. "I'm afraid I'm not familiar with that term, Miss Marple." "I think you are, Lieutenant Hawkins," she countered gently. The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Then, remarkably, Hawthorne's lips curved in a slight smile. "You've been busy, Miss Marple. I've always heard you were formidable, but I confess I underestimated you." His voice had changed, the cultivated clerical tones giving way to something harder, more clipped. "However, connecting me to a wartime operation proves nothing regarding Mrs. Pritchard's unfortunate death." "We have evidence," Inspector Craddock stated firmly. "Evidence that you were the one who betrayed the Needlepoint network, not the weaver who was executed for your crimes." "Indeed." Hawthorne's eyebrow rose skeptically. "And what might this evidence be?" Miss Marple opened her knitting bag and withdrew Madeleine Fournier's diary. This belonged to Madeleine Fournier, a member of the network. She suspected you before her capture, and left this where it wouldn't be found by the Germans. A French diary from a woman decades dead. Hawthorne's laugh held no humor. Hardly compelling evidence in any court, especially after all this time. Eleanor thought otherwise, Miss Marple said quietly. She recognized you when you came to St. Mary Mead, didn't she? Not immediately, perhaps, but something about you triggered her memory. When she began working with the declassified files, she found discrepancies that could only be explained if the communications officer, you, had deliberately altered crucial information. Supposition, Hawthorne dismissed. Nothing that would stand up to scrutiny. There's more. Miss Marple carefully turned the pages of the diary to where the white shepherd's purse was pressed between the leaves. Madeleine discovered your signature, Lieutenant. Your vanity was your undoing. You marked the altered communications with your namesake flower, shepherd's purse, a clever play on your code name, the Shepherd. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Hawthorne's face. That proves nothing. You can't possibly connect a pressed flower from 1943 to me. But we can, Inspector Craddock interjected. Colonel Edwards survived your attempt on his life. He's provided a sworn statement about the photograph he showed to Eleanor, the one identifying you as Lieutenant Hawkins. It was a bluff. The colonel remained unconscious, but it worked. Hawthorne's composure cracked, his expression hardening. Edwards should have minded his own business, just as Eleanor should have. His hand moved swiftly to the desk drawer, withdrawing a small revolver. This has gone quite far enough. The constables outside will have heard the confession, Miss Marple said calmly, despite the weapon now pointed at her. There are no constables, Miss Marple. I watched from the window as the inspector arrived with only you. Hawthorne's smile was cold. You've played your hand well, but the game ends here. At that moment, the study door burst open, revealing not constables, but Dolly Bantry, her face flushed with excitement. Jane, I knocked, but no one answered. I simply had to tell you the most extraordinary. She broke off, taking in the scene before her. Oh, I do beg your pardon. I didn't realize you had company. The momentary distraction was all Inspector Craddock needed. He lunged across the desk, seizing Hawthorne's wrist and forcing the gun upward. A shot rang out, shattering the ceiling light as the two men struggled. Miss Marple pulled the startled Mrs. Bantry to safety behind a large bookcase. The study door crashed open again as two village constables, alerted by the gunshot, rushed in to assist. Within moments, Hawthorne was subdued and handcuffed, his expression a mixture of fury and resignation. You should have left it buried, he spat at Miss Marple. What does it matter now, who betrayed whom 30 years ago? It mattered to Eleanor, she replied quietly. It mattered enough that she gave her life to uncover the truth. And it matters to the family of the Weaver, who has lived under the shadow of his supposed treachery all these years. As Inspector Craddock led Hawthorne away, Mrs. Bantry turned to Miss Marple with wide eyes. Jane, whatever has been happening? The vicar with a gun? I never would have believed it. It's a long story, Dolly. Miss Marple carefully replaced the diary in her knitting bag. Perhaps you'd care to come for tea tomorrow, and I'll explain it all. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat by her fireside, continuing her work on Eleanor's knitting pattern. With each stitch, she was transforming it from a cipher into a beautiful shawl, a fitting memorial to a woman who had sacrificed her life for truth. The telephone rang, bringing news that Colonel Edwards had regained consciousness and was expected to make a full recovery. One more loose end, tied neatly, like the final stitch in a complex pattern. Chapter 6. Case Unravelled. 3 weeks after the dramatic events at the vicarage, Miss Marple sat in her garden room with Inspector Craddock, enjoying a pot of Darjeeling tea as pale winter sunshine streamed through the windows. The inspector had come to St. Mary Mead to update her on the case's conclusion before the official records were sealed. "I must thank you again, Miss Marple," Craddock said, accepting a delicate china cup. "Without your insight, Hawthorne might never have been brought to justice." "It was Eleanor who deserves the credit," Miss Marple replied, adjusting her shawl, the very one she had completed from Eleanor's pattern. She recognized the truth, and was brave enough to pursue it, even knowing the danger. "Indeed." The inspector set down his cup. "I thought you'd like to know that Hawthorne has made a full confession. Not out of remorse, I'm afraid, but as part of a plea arrangement. The authorities were keen to avoid a public trial that would reopen old wartime wounds." "I suspected as much." Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. "And the details of his betrayal?" "Much as you deduced." Craddock opened his notebook, though it was clear he hardly needed to refer to it. James Hawkins was a communications officer assigned to Operation Needlepoint in 1943. His role gave him access to all encoded messages before they were transmitted to agents in the field. "The perfect position from which to betray the network," Miss Marple observed. "Precisely. But unlike many traitors who act from ideology, Hawkins did it purely for money. The Germans paid him handsomely for each agent he helped them capture." Craddock's voice held disgust. "After several successful interceptions, they gave him a code name of his own, the Shepherd, a reference to his role in leading Allied agents to slaughter." Miss Marple nodded. "And after the war, when investigations began, he needed a scapegoat." "Yes. A junior officer codenamed the Weaver had worked closely with Hawkins. Using his knowledge of codes and his access to records, Hawkins carefully constructed a trail of evidence implicating the Weaver as the traitor. The young man protested his innocence until the end, but the fabricated evidence seemed overwhelming, while Hawkins himself received a commendation for helping to uncover the traitor," Craddock said grimly. "After the war, he left the military and eventually took religious orders. The transition from Lieutenant Hawkins to Reverend Hawthorne was carefully managed. A new first name, a slightly altered surname. The church, I'm sorry to say, wasn't particularly rigorous about background checks in those days, especially for a decorated veteran with excellent references. And he might have remained undiscovered if Eleanor hadn't recognized him," Miss Marple mused. "That's what's remarkable," Craddock replied. "Eleanor never actually met Hawkins during the war. Their paths never crossed directly, but she had an exceptional memory for details and patterns." "The photograph," Miss Marple guessed. "Exactly. When Colonel Edwards showed her that group photograph, she recognized Hawkins from having seen it years before in the Foreign Office files. But more importantly, she had just discovered discrepancies in the communication logs she was translating, altered coordinates and timing instructions that could only have been changed by someone in Hawkins's position." Miss Marple poured more tea for them both. "And how did Eleanor confront him?" "She didn't, initially. She was cautious, gathering evidence first. She approached Colonel Edwards during her visit to St. Mary Mead, confirming her suspicions with the photograph." Craddock closed his notebook. "Then she sent you the coded knitting pattern, a clever use of the very technique that Needlepoint had employed. Only after ensuring her evidence was safely distributed did she confront Hawthorne." "He invited her to the vicarage that evening," Miss Marple said quietly. "Yes. As a trusted colleague from the past, He easily gained her confidence. He prepared tea, adding a sedative first, then a lethal dose of sleeping pills once she was incapacitated. Afterward, he drove her back to London and arranged her body in her flat to suggest suicide. A cold-blooded plan, calculating to the end. He even placed your address in her typewriter, thinking the police would assume she was writing to you before taking her life. A final communication with an old friend. Instead, it led you directly to me, and to her real message in the knitting pattern, Miss Marple observed with a slight smile. Indeed it did. Craddock sipped his tea thoughtfully. When he realized Colonel Edwards had shown Eleanor the photograph, Hawthorne attempted the same method again, doctoring the Colonel's sleeping medication and removing the incriminating photograph from his desk. And he would have made a third attempt on my life if we hadn't confronted him when we did, Miss Marple added calmly, as though discussing nothing more alarming than the weather. The inspector nodded grimly. You took an extraordinary risk, Miss Marple. Not at all. I was quite certain you had positioned those constables outside the vicarage, even if Reverend Hawthorne hadn't spotted them. Her blue eyes twinkled momentarily. Though I confess, Dolly Bantry's timely interruption was pure chance. She has always had a remarkable gift for appearing at critical moments. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece and the distant sounds of village life beyond the garden. There is one other piece of news you should know, Craddock said eventually. The case of the Weaver, Lieutenant Thomas Weaver, has been officially reopened. Based on the evidence Eleanor uncovered and Hawthorne's confession, his name will be posthumously cleared. His family will finally know the truth. After all these years, Miss Marple murmured. That would have meant a great deal to Eleanor. The Foreign Office is also establishing a small memorial fund in her name, a scholarship for young women studying cryptography and code analysis. Craddock smiled slightly. They're calling it the Pritchard Pattern Recognition Prize. How fitting, Miss Marple approved. Eleanor always did have an eye for patterns, just as Madeleine Fournier did before her. It was that gift that ultimately brought justice, even if it came decades late. The following Sunday, Miss Marple attended the memorial service for Eleanor Pritchard at St. Mary Mead's Church. A new vicar had been hastily appointed, a kindly, middle-aged man with an open face that suggested no hidden depths or dark secrets. The church was full, many villagers attending out of curiosity after the scandalous arrest of Reverend Hawthorne, but some, like Miss Marple, out of genuine respect for Eleanor. After the service, Miss Marple approached a tall, austere woman who bore a striking resemblance to Eleanor, her younger sister, Margaret, who had travelled from Edinburgh for the memorial. Miss Pritchard, Miss Marple greeted her, I was a dear friend of your sister's. I wanted you to have this. She presented a tissue-wrapped package. Margaret unwrapped it to reveal the completed shawl, Eleanor's unfinished pattern, now transformed into a thing of beauty. Eleanor began this, Miss Marple explained gently. I thought it right to complete it for her. Margaret Pritchard's eyes filled with tears as she touched the delicate wool. Thank you. Eleanor wrote to me about your knitting circle. She always said you were the most skilled among them. Your sister had her own unique skills, Miss Marple replied. It was her attention to detail, her ability to see patterns that others missed, that revealed the truth in the end. Later, as they walked toward the Lich Gate, Inspector Craddock joined Miss Marple. A fitting tribute, he observed, though I notice you didn't explain to her sister the true significance of that shawl. Some things are better left unsaid, Miss Marple replied. Margaret knows her sister died heroically, uncovering a long-buried injustice. The exact method by which Eleanor communicated her discovery would only cause more pain. They paused at the gate, watching as the other mourners dispersed in twos and threes, exchanging quiet conversation. "I visited Colonel Edwards at the hospital yesterday," Craddock mentioned. "He's making an excellent recovery. The doctors say he should be able to return home next week." "I'm very glad to hear it. I've been knitting him a scarf, something simple and comforting." Miss Marple smiled slightly. Not all patterns need to conceal secrets. "What will happen to Madeline's diary?" the inspector asked as they walked slowly down the church path. "It will go to the War Office archives, along with Eleanor's notes. After all this time, there's historical value in the truth being known, at least in official records, even if the public never hears the full story." At the village green, they paused to part ways. The winter sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows across the frosted grass. "You know, Miss Marple," Craddock said thoughtfully, "knitting patterns and human nature do have much in common, as you once suggested. Both appear simple on the surface, but contain complexities that only reveal themselves when you look closely at each stitch and turn." She finished with a smile. "Precisely, Inspector. And in both cases, it's the irregularities that often tell the true story. The dropped stitch, the unexpected change in tension or color. Just as it was the irregularities in Hawthorne's carefully constructed persona that eventually betrayed him." Craddock nodded. The cold eyes that Eleanor recognized, the momentary stiffening when her name was mentioned. "Human nature follows patterns just as surely as wool on needles," Miss Marple agreed. "Once you understand the basic pattern, the deviations become not just noticeable, but significant." They said their goodbyes, Inspector Craddock returning to London and his next case, Miss Marple, to her cottage, where her knitting basket awaited. The simple scarf for Colonel Edwards was nearly finished. A straightforward pattern in a warm, comfortable wool. No codes, no hidden messages, just the steady rhythm of needles creating something useful and beautiful. As dusk fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her fireside, the clicking of her needles a counterpoint to the ticking clock and crackling flames. Outside her window, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, eternal patterns that had guided travelers for centuries. Inside, an elderly spinster with shrewd blue eyes and nimble fingers continued her own pattern-making, confident in the knowledge that order could always be found, even in the most tangled of human affairs. For while some patterns concealed darkness, as Eleanor Pritchard had discovered to her cost, others, like the simple scarf growing steadily between Miss Marple's practiced hands, brought only comfort and healing. And in the end, it was this balance between darkness and light, complexity and simplicity, that made the human tapestry so endlessly fascinating to one who had spent a lifetime observing its intricate design.